Earlier this week, the National Bureau of Statistics released the official figures on the capital flows to Nigeria in the first quarter of this year, 2025. Foreign capital flows are among the indicators governments use to measure the willingness and confidence investors have in the economic and financial opportunities within a country. Well, tonight, Babajide Ogusol, who is the founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's chief data analyst, is right here to look beyond the headlines and share the latest insight from Nigeria's foreign capital inflow report. Babajide, great to have you on the News at 10 again.
Good evening, Ayatollah.
Yes, great to see you. Now, headline capital importation report that was released this week shows there's more foreign capital flows coming into the country. Now, is there any twist to this positive trend, Babajide?
Yes, there's a twist, and I'd like to start from that twist. You know, it's now a dozen years past the decade when the first man that was recorded to have ever married while in space, that happened about this time in 2003. A man was in space, a Russian, Yuri Malachenko. He married his wife who was down on Earth while he was in space. And today, yes, they are celebrating a dozen and a decade years after. But beyond this marriage, the question tonight is, what sort of marriage is Nigeria having with its own investors? Because is it a marriage based on love? Is it a marriage based on respect and honor? Or is Nigeria's marriage with its investors based on money? And the evidence shows there's good, and Ayotunde, there's really some bad news. Let's take a look at, within the same charts, good and bad news. Now, here's what I mean. If you take a look at the table in front of you, you can clearly see what has happened in the last 5 quarters. The evidence we have today shows capital imported into Nigeria in the first quarter of this year, $5.6 billion. That is significantly above any of the previous quarters where we had seen a range of between $1.9 to $3.3 billion. The point here is $5.6 billion of capital importation in the first quarter of this year is 67% more than what it was in the same period in the first quarter of last year. So that is the good news. However, right in front of you as well is the bad news. Who is bringing in this capital? We can clearly see the previous trends. 51 to 61%. Previously, that was the range of capital that came in from foreign portfolio investors, pretty much those that were investing in stocks and bonds. But what happened in the first quarter of this year? 92% of all capital that came into Nigeria came from foreign portfolio investors. In simple terms, most of that money is coming in from those that want to buy bonds. Now the question is, why are foreign portfolio investors so crazy about Nigeria's bonds? Ayotunde, 3 words: attractive interest payments. And so the good news is Nigeria is yes attracting a lot of capital, significantly more than it had previously done in the last 4 quarters. However, most of this money, short-term funds. Most of this money is coming because Nigeria's bonds, Nigeria's borrowings are paying investors a juicy interest rate. And so, good news and bad news. Can we sustain such payments on the bonds?
Interesting. So let's take it a little bit further now and look at foreign capital, or should I say flow of capital to other countries in the world, especially in Africa. What can you tell us about that?
There are 3 things I can tell you about that, 3 things that are very important. The first is, last year, the United Nations makes it clear that total capital, foreign capital that went around all countries, $1.5 trillion. Out of the $1.5 trillion, Ayotunde, 6% of that amount came into Africa, point 1. Point 2 is, last year, more than all capital that came into Africa went to one country. More than half of all the capital that came into Africa last year went to Egypt. Point 3 is what makes me worried. What makes me worried is capital coming into Nigeria relative to Africa is on the decline. Now, to make this easier for you to understand, let's take a look at the chart of the week. because we then can clearly see how much money is coming into Africa and how much of that is coming into Nigeria. And if you take a look at that chart of the week, you can clearly see, as at 2020, $40.9 billion came into Africa, 6% of that amount came into Nigeria. 2021, out of all the money that came into Africa, 4% came into Nigeria. But here's what the United Nations tells us. Last year, from their reports, the report shows that $97 billion of capital, foreign direct investment to be specific, came into Africa, $97 billion. How much ended up in Nigeria? Just 1%. And these are the facts from the United Nations. So the concern we're seeing is capital, yes, is coming to Africa, but most of that capital is now no longer coming into Nigeria. It's going to Egypt, it's going to Cote d'Ivoire, it's going to Kenya, it's going to Senegal, it's going to Ghana, and very little finds up in Nigeria. And so perhaps that's why we can clearly now all put it all together, is that the strategy is bring in foreign portfolio investors and attract them with interest payments. Good news, but yet it's bad news.
Bad news. And finally, just before we go, despite these uncertainties, and of course, looking at what you just talked about there as far as Nigeria is concerned, which sectors in Nigeria, are investors really betting on?
Overall, investors are betting on manufacturing and trade. And if you take a look at those numbers, clearly, as at this time, 2014, the amount of capital that came into manufacturing and trade as at 2014 was $1 billion. Now, as at 2024, amount of capital coming into manufacturing and trade in Nigeria, $2.5 billion. We can clearly see that the oil and gas sector, investors are really not betting in it. A decade ago, $200 million was coming into the oil and gas sector. 2024 in Nigeria, capital coming into the oil and gas sector from the report of the National Bureau of Statistics, $5 million. However, what we see is a lot of the governors within the Niger Delta, especially looking at some of the statements that the governor of Bayelsa made earlier this week regarding their plans and the overall position of Nigeria. We can clearly see that there's some hope. And if you take a look at his statement, is the governor's position, and that's the governor of Bayelsa, saying an investment in Nigeria is an investment in the beating heart of Africa, a place where innovation meets one of the world's youngest and most creative populations. And in his words, in Bayelsa, we do not seek investors as visitors. We welcome you as a partner in shaping a shared prosperity. So clearly that is coming on the back of real evidence that shows that there's still investment coming into the oil and gas sector, but not as much as it was a decade ago. And yes, we see governors, especially governors in the Niger Delta region, especially like Doyodiri, trying to say they're looking at alternative ways of shaping partnerships within their region. So good news, bad news. Let's not forget, the rain, when it comes, yes, it can be used to make the crops grow, but the rain as well can be used to wash away the crops. So we have to be careful of how we use our rain in Nigeria.
We have to be careful indeed, and of course, we hope the government will take this seriously and look into it as we move on. Well, thank you so much, Babajide, for your analysis, as always.
We'll do this again next week, Ayatollah.
Definitely.